What are Hungry Varesa's biggest pros and cons? That's what I'm here to tell you today. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. To start things off, she is an absolutely excellent Electro DPS. Now, she's not the best anymore, and I'll touch on that more a little bit later, but for now, know that she is a very good Electro DPS, and she's going to be able to perfectly fulfill your needs in this regard. She mostly plays in overload teams, and Genshin seems to account for that by the fact that Chevrus is on her banner, so all around, teammates aren't really going to be an issue for you either, and with that being said, she's at least able to set herself apart from Flins in that way, because Varesa herself is an overload unit, and Flins is an electro-charged unit. So she's got that going for her. And that's another thing that I want to talk about a little bit more. She has her 4-star teammates on her banner, and if you don't have Moika, or if you just simply want to play her as the main DPS on the second half, well, you're easily able to form a fully 4-star team with Varesa, and it's actually going to be good. Chevrus, Eonsan, even either Shangling, Bennett, or Pyro MC are going to be able to form you a perfectly competent Varesa team. So not only does she have good 4-star teammates that she's able to use, but she's able to form them from the characters that are literally going to be on her banner. Not only did she have them on her original banner, but they're doing it again. So Hoyoverse is acutely aware of the fact that Varesa ideally wants to be played with Chevrus in an overload team. So you're not really going to have to worry about going and getting teammates for her. I will say that in an ideal world, you do play Moika within her teams, but if you would rather just save her to be played as a main DPS herself, which makes sense considering how strong she is, or if you simply don't have Moika, while in an ideal world you would want her, it's not like the character is not going to be valuable without Moika, and you don't have to have any reservations about getting her if you simply don't have the motorcyclist. She's not going to make or break your Varesa because she has such budget-friendly teammate options. And another thing that should be mentioned is that while Varesa does have a strong signature weapon, she's not reliant on it, and she's still able to perform without it. So with that in mind, Varesa ends up being a very budget-friendly DPS, because while Flins is indeed the current best Electro DPS in the game, he is still more expensive on the whole compared to Varesa. Now, I will say later why I do still think that Varesa isn't exactly cheap, and I do think that you can kind of be misled into thinking that Varesa is a completely budget-friendly unit when she's not. However, she is still at least a little bit cheaper than Flins, and is all around able to perform quite well, even if you don't have more expensive options for her. Another thing that I should mention is that she's also the best Plunge DPS, so if that's a playstyle that you're interested in, well then Varesa is going to be very good there. Xiao hasn't really received any major updates, so he's pretty much still behind Varesa in terms of best Plunge DPS, same with Gaming. All around, Varesa still sits as the best Plunge DPS in the game, so if you're really fond of that playstyle, then perhaps you can consider investing into her. She also doesn't rely on Xianyun, so that's another really nice quality of hers. She also doesn't need 5-star teammates, and I would say how big of a deal this is kind of depends on what type of person you are and how you've handled your account up until this point. But I feel like some people are really going to value this, considering how Genshin Impact teams have recently been handled as of late. As of late, whenever it comes to these teams, you usually have your DPS, and then a support that significantly enhances the performance of that DPS. Look at Nafer and Lauma, look at Flins and Anefa, look at Skirk and Escoffier. This is the general trend that Hoyoverse has been following recently. Durin is an exception because he is an S-tier release in terms of meta value, but is basically able to work anywhere where you need a Pyro sub DPS, and is also very strong for Hex and Circle characters on the whole. Speaking of which, you're actually able to use Durin in place of Moika in Varesa teams, and that's actually going to be good. Yes, you're not going to have another Hex and Circle character there in order to trigger the Hex and Circle buffs, generally speaking. However, he is still going to be a very good teammate there. And overall, the point stands that recently, when it comes to new main DPS releases, the way that Hoyoverse has been handling it is that there is a DPS, and then there is the support that they really, really, really want. Varesa isn't like that. While she does ideally want Moika, she doesn't really require her. She doesn't require any specific type of character other than the 4-star teammates that she ideally wants to be played with, such as Chevrus and Eonsan, which are on her banner, so ideally, the intention is that you would be able to form her team after you've pulled on her banner. Now, unless you get super lucky and you get her within a couple of pulls and then you're not really interested in pulling on her banner more, you should be able to get at least one of each. Now, obviously 4-star pulling in Genshin is a bit finicky, as we all know. You can never really guarantee that you get a specific 4-star, even if you pull a lot. However, that is the intention at least. So, generally speaking, I would say that if you're really against these DPSs that want another specific teammate in order to be really good, or at least be able to reach their max performance, or if you simply want a DPS that doesn't really require another 5-star in order to feel good and just be solid out of the box, then honestly, Varesa is not a bad investment whatsoever. She is going to be able to fulfill that for you. So all around, while she's not the best Electro DPS anymore, I do still feel like she fulfills a very important role in the meta, and she still offers an Electro DPS option that is definitely cheaper in a sense, and at least a bit more accessible to somebody that doesn't have a very large character roster. So all around, good character. However, we do still have to discuss the negative aspect of her, with one of those obviously being that Flins is just a better Electro DPS, and I generally like to place a lot of value on best in slot. I have already went over the situations in which you might prefer Varesa as an Electro DPS, or where she might be a bit more accessible to you, but generally speaking, Flins is going to be better. Another thing that I would like to remind you of is that Columbina is coming up soon, so even though the gap between Varesa and Flins isn't really that big right now, yes, Flins is better, but it's not by some astronomical margin that absolutely puts Varesa in the dirt. I wouldn't be surprised if by the time we do get Columbina, that does kind of end up being the case. And if not necessarily the exact case, then I do still expect Flins to be significantly better than Varesa very, very soon. But at least as it currently stands, investing into Flins is just going to offer you a better team. If you don't have an Effa, you can just pull for C1 Flins, therefore circumventing the need to pull for an Effa. Shoot, if you invest a little bit more into your Flins, you're going to get a better DPS on the whole. And that's another thing in of itself. Varesa's own high Primogem-based investment has nothing on Flins' high Primogem-based investment. His own C1 is very strong, his own constellations are very strong, and Effa's constellations are very good. Columbina is inevitably going to create a much larger gap between the two. All around, all I can say is that if you're not really that particularly interested in Varesa in particular, and you don't really have any particular investment in her, and you just want a good Electro DPS, just get Flins instead. He is going to be a lot more worth your time. He's still going to work out of the box even if you don't have an Effa. Definitely not going to be as strong as he potentially could be, but he's definitely going to be good at the very least. And then when you do get an Effa, holy guacamole, you're going to have yourself quite the strong Electro DPS. And once we eventually get Columbina, yeah, enough said, it's going to be something else alright. Sure, Flins is more expensive, and that's why I said that if you just want a more accessible DPS, sure, Varesa is going to be better, and you're not really getting a bad DPS out of the exchange. However, if you're willing to pull for Columbina and eventually an Effa down the line, I'm telling you, Flins is just going to be better. And another thing is that, sure, right now the jump might not look that big, but once we get Columbina, yeah, the jump is just going to kind of be that big. And finally, 4-star constellations. I feel like I could just end the sentence there, but I'll speak about it a little bit more. Getting a 4-star C6 is not easy. It is generally something that you build up over the course of many banners. Now, if you're pulling for Varesa constellations, maybe you'll be in a slightly better position. But to this, I would say, I have had pull sessions where I've been after a specific 4-star, and I have been able to pull multiple 5-stars before even getting one of the 4-star that I am interested in getting. It took me so long to max out my Farazan, that is the example that I always personally used. However, even with a character like Chevreuse, it took me ages to completely max out her constellations. Over the course of numerous banners, in fact. And I pulled on quite a few banners that have had Chevreuse before, but it took me forever to finally get her to C6. Now, I will say that C6 Chevreuse is a little bit overhyped, because it's still a buff that needs to build up, and on average, you're only really going to have about 30 to 40% of the 60% damage bonus percent. So there is that. But I will say that, generally speaking, having the constellations for the 4-stars in Varesa's team is very much a big help, especially on Chevreuse and Dionsan, and saying that getting a 4-star to C6 is an easy task would be the lie of the century. I think that everybody is well informed of that by this point. And this is why I say that Varesa is cheap in air quotes. I will call her accessible, because you can quickly assemble a team for her, but I am not going to call her super duper budget friendly, the most budget friendly DPS there is, when you ideally want constellations on these 4-stars, and getting 4-star cons is just not that cheap. I personally think that getting an Effa for your Flins is honestly going to be a cheaper endeavor than getting C6 Eonsan and C6 Chevreuse. And another thing is that unless you get insanely lucky with your 4-star pulls, and this is your first time pulling for Varesa, you're not gonna be getting C6 from nothing if you don't already have these characters. This isn't really gonna be as much of a problem for anybody that's been playing the game for a longer period of time, and has been able to collect a couple of copies of these characters from other banners and events and whatever, etc, etc. However, for people that are pulling for Varesa for the first time that don't have any of these 4 stars, or perhaps they just don't have their constellations complete, I wouldn't bank on getting all of the constellations this banner. I do think that Varesa can still definitely be called budget-friendly and at least accessible, but I don't really think that this quality of hers is enough to put her above Flins. Just no, unfortunately. Flins is gonna be better once Columbina releases. He already is better, in fact, but it's definitely gonna be a larger gap once we do get the Moon Goddess released. And another thing is that while she is more budget-friendly than Flins, not only can you just get his C1 instead of getting an FA, but she is still not really as budget-friendly as you might want to believe. She is definitely accessible, but not to the point where she totally outclasses Flins in this regard. I honestly think that getting a 5-star is a lot easier than getting 2 4-stars to C6 from scratch. Not everybody's going to be going from scratch in fairness, so this is going to be relative to your account, but the point still stands. Hopefully this video is able to tell you Varesa's biggest pros and cons. This has been Juice, signing out, and I hope you enjoy stomping on your enemies.